Hello, and welcome back to Measuring Learner Data and Assessment. This is Week 4, Lecture 1, Evaluating the Impact of Assessment on Student Lives, Past and Present. As we have seen in previous week's lectures and discussions, assessment has the opportunity to impact lives of a variety of stakeholders. How has that impact changed over time? How do these changes affect the perception of assessment? Students. Tests and assessment have always been a large part of the education process for students. There's always been the need to have some kind of quantifiable measure at the end of a unit of learning to see whether or not there's been progress or achievement of goals. The difference is that, in the past, and in terms of student perception, the test was part of a series of assessments that carried at least somewhat similar weights. There usually wasn't just one test that determined your future. Or if there were other activities or assignments, projects, written work, homework, etc., that allowed students to exhibit their skill in content acquisition. Additionally, there were other avenues that students could take if their testing abilities were not that strong. Vocational training, shop classes, etc. There were other things for students to get excited about and engaged around, and those things weren't only assessment-based. To be clear, it seems like assessment used to be proof of an education. Today, it seems like assessment is education. What I mean to say is that, from the student's perspective, school has no other purpose than to build towards a test. We start our year with diagnostic assessments to see where they're at, throw quizzes and tests at them throughout the year, and end the year with a test that determines whether or not they can continue. Everyone's path is basically the same. We've trained our students to think that the test, which is generally how assessment is viewed, is the only thing that matters. I've seen this personally in my own classes. Students don't get as excited as they used to for the simulations, projects, debates, and artistic endeavors that I try to include as they used to. They don't worry about putting in the effort to do a great job. Same holds true of homework. It's a struggle to inspire students to complete anything. But if you tell them that it is a test, the face changes. They become serious. They know that now it's real. How does this affect their perception? Students have always been stressed out by tests and known that their performance on assessments have the ability to impact their academic standing and future achievement. But it has only been since the introduction of high-stakes testing that has connected funding and aid for schools that we have seen students become focused solely on doing well on tests. In a broader sense, this impacts perception of assessment. I've repeatedly used test and assessment somewhat interchangeably in this section. But when you become more stringent with your definitions, we see perceptions change. Assessment is any tool that measures learning, not just a test as our students see them now. The perception of tests has changed, become more paramount in students' eyes, which means we can say that the converse is true of other assessments. If students don't think it's a test, then they don't think it matters. This could have far-reaching impacts on our assessment data and our ability to measure student achievement, since their perception of the assessment colors their effort and therefore their output. Teachers. Since tests and assessments have always impacted students, it is safe to say that they have also always impacted teachers. Assessments were prepared as a way to reflect student achievement on learning objectives. They were a teacher's evidence that goals had been met. The important part of this statement is the fact that they were a teacher's evidence. The educator set goals for their class, taught through whatever means they felt were most appropriate, and assessed to see growth. There didn't need to be any certain type of assessment. That was left up to the teacher and the needs of the class or content area. So an assessment could be a written composition, it could be a portfolio, it could be something that was built or fabricated, or it could be a traditional test. A teacher's prerogative gave them the freedom to assess as they saw fit. In the present, choice diminishes further and further in our profession. Educational law and standards, as covered last week, have increased the amount of oversight and expectation that is associated with assessment and testing. No longer do teachers have the freedom to assess only when and where they feel it is appropriate. Now we must assess when we are told, and the assessment usually must be standardized. This changes everything about being an educator. Pace of curriculum introduction is increased. Scope and sequence become slaves to the test as prescribed by outside actors. So how does this affect our perception? Assessment has and always will be important to educators for reasons we've discussed at length. But the idea of the prevalence of the test rising so highly is one that has had severe impacts on the perception of teachers about assessment. So much instructional time is spent now on different activities that are supposed to prepare students for assessment, review, enrichment, test prep, etc., all geared towards a specific test. How many of us have not railed against the idea of teaching to the test? I don't feel that I'm speaking only for myself when I say that this rise in testing as assessment and the rise in the amount of testing we see makes me question whether or not I'm truly an educator as I dreamt I would be when I started. Am I providing a real education that inspires and engages these students? Or am I just an automaton that is pushing them from test to test without any real internalization of the content? How we perceive what we are doing is integral to our performance. So the questions teachers are asking about the role of testing as assessment are hugely important. Families. It must be said again that in the past, the test was seen as an easy reflection of growth and accomplishment. This is true for the student and the educator, and it is true from the family perspective as well. How many of us have memories of coming home from school to that possibly anxiety-inducing question from our parents? How'd the test go? If it went well, it could end up on the refrigerator, a constant reminder of our success and a bastion of our brilliance. If it didn't, it could be the cause of lonely hours in our rooms studying to try and do better next time. Families traditionally supported school attempts to assess their children. The thought process might go something like, teachers teach because they know the content and how to present it. They teach, so they know what's best in the classroom. So the test must be necessary. How's it changed in the present? Families are in a tough spot. There's still the desire to see clear results regarding student performance, and assessment and tests provide that. But parents are beginning now to see that the amount of testing that is being required due to changes in state and national standard adoption is untenable and unfair to students. This puts parents in a position where they are trying to support their schools while also advocating for their children. At some point, something has to give. I believe we are seeing that point now, where we are seeing many parents opt their students out of state assessments. So what are the effects on perception? It can be argued that this is one area where the effect of negative perception surrounding increased assessment is having an unintended positive impact. Because of the shift in perception on the part of families from a positive and trusting perspective to one of trepidation and mistrust, parents are becoming more informed about the myriad of assessments their children are being asked to complete and involving themselves more in the process. I say this is positive because families flexing their decision-making power is the surest and quickest way to effect meaningful change. What's the cost of assessment versus the benefits? First, what are the physical and mental costs of assessment? It's a fact of economics that everything has a cost. This is true of assessment as well. Costs of assessment can be discussed in two categories, physical and mental. Physical costs first. The big one here is time. Assessment costs student time to actually complete, no matter the type of assessment. This is time that could be spent doing other learning. As I said earlier, time is also spent in the classroom preparing for assessment, another instance of time that could be spent engaging in other activities, another cost. This cost also impacts teacher preparation time since assessments must be prepared, proctored, collected, and graded. Teachers could be using that time for other tasks and preparation. Other physical costs involve materials. The paper, ink, bindings, and shipping, depending on the level of assessment, all cost. Some of this can be offset by utilizing technology, but some costs will always be present, especially when using a company-created assessment, since their motives will always involve profit. Second is mental costs. It would seem that, in some ways, the purpose of assessment is to affect a mental cost. Content and curriculum are the deposit, assessment is the withdrawal. I would agree with that to a certain extent. What I'm talking about here is mental cost beyond the intention, basically anxiety. There is such a good thing as good anxiety. A student that doesn't feel nervous at all about an upcoming assessment is either arrogant, disengaged, or some combination of the two. But assessment or testing that is so copious as to leave the students in a debilitating state of anxiousness is unforgivable. This type of anxiety, the bad type, can be partially chalked up to another kind of cost, what I would call expectation cost. This is the idea that performance on this particular assessment or group of assessments can have an enormous impact on the remainder of the test taker's life. If you've ever seen a student break down and cry prior to a state exam even starting, you've seen this cost at work. A balance must be struck. Benefits of assessment have been previously discussed and do not really need to be recovered in detail here. Suffice it to say that assessment can provide a lot of data about students' level of functioning, diagnostic and summative, and or achievement, formative, interim, and summative. How can this relationship impact our decision making? If the cost is higher than the benefit, economically speaking, the decision is unsound. Does this translate to education? Absolutely. We're seeing parents across the nation go through this decision-making process and repeatedly decide that the benefit does not outweigh the cost. This is the opt-out movement. Sadly, we as educators are not given that much power in the district, state, or national arenas. So even if we apply a cost-benefit analysis to these assessments and find that they are unsound as defined above, we may not be able to affect that much or even any change. But we can affect change in our own practice. How? Develop a cost-benefit analysis rubric of your own. It doesn't have to be all that complex, but you should be able to plug in the different types of costs that any assessment you have developed demand, determine the benefits of the assessment, and come up with a solution regarding whether or not your assessment is a sound one. If you're interested, plug a district, state, national, or company-created assessment into your rubric. Even if you find it is not sound and realize there is not much you can do about it, you can use that information to inform your practice surrounding the assessment. The increase in testing and assessment at all levels of education has obviously impacted the lives of all stakeholders. These impacts have pushed student, teacher, and family perceptions of assessment to shift as well. As educators, it is incumbent upon us to recognize these shifts in perception, attempt to measure the various costs that assessment have on us and our students, weigh those costs against the benefits of the assessments, and make our professional decisions accordingly. Hopefully, in time, this type of thinking will begin to impact those decision makers at higher levels so a healthy and productive balance can be struck.